Hi, I'm Julie, and this is a general biology video series all about inheritance, and we are going to concentrate on Mendelian genetics. Okay, let's get started. So, the question is, why? If you have a plant, let's say a garden pea with flowers that are purple, and that plant mates with another plant, garden pea plant, with purple flowers, why sometimes do you get a plant with white flowers? And that has to do with inheritance. How is that trait of flower color inherited? Well, there was a gentleman back in 1856 by the name of Gregor Mendel, and he studied this. He studied inheritance. And he was a teacher of natural history, and he had access to huge gardens where he could grow plants and raise animals. So he looked at inheritance in many different kinds of plants and animals. And he finally chose the garden pea as a model system to do his study of inheritance. And the reason why the garden pea is a model system is because the garden pea had 7 characteristics, each characteristic with just 2 traits, 2 distinct traits that were easily identifiable. So our 7 characteristics: seed shape, seed color, flower color, pod shape, pod color, flower position, stem height, and each of those had a distinctive trait. So the trait is of seed shape. The 2 traits can be round seed shape or wrinkled seed shape. So for flower color, you can have for the characteristic of flower color, you can have the trait of purple flower or the trait of white flower. At the time that Gregor Mendel was doing this study, many people hypothesized that inheritance, the traits that offspring get from their parents, is blended. But what Gregor Mendel showed was that at least in these traits, that they were not blended, that when the parents had specific traits, that the offspring could inherit those traits, those distinct traits, either a round seed or a wrinkled seed. It was not blended. And that's called a discontinuous trait. So a discontinuous trait has very distinct characteristics. So let's go ahead and put that. Let me get my pen. So we have discontinuous traits. And those are traits that are easily distinguishable. Easily distinguishable. But at the time, many people thought that traits were blended. So there are some traits that are continuous, which make it seem like they might be blended. So for example, well, let's go ahead and define this. So continuous might show many small differences oops, there's another L on there, small differences, so that it might seem like they're blended. And let's take example. So one of the characteristics that Mendel looked at, was stem height. So either tall plant or a short plant. And at the time they thought that if these two plants were crossed, a tall and a short, that you would get something blended, some mix, some intermediate in between. And if a trait is continuous, there might be small differences, so that you might get heights in between. And that made it look like that they might be blended. But this characteristic in a garden pea was easy. It was either tall or it was short. Okay, so all of his traits ended up being discontinuous. So they're easily distinguishable, distinct traits. Okay, let's see. He also showed that he demonstrated that the traits in these plants are transmitted from parents to offspring in a specific pattern, because he was a mathematician and he planted, 30,000 plants, garden peas, for his study, and he kept track of them and kept track of all the numbers. So he noticed from the numbers a specific pattern. So how did he do this? Well, because he had so many numbers, he had 30,000 plants, he knew from his results that it wasn't just by chance, that there really was a pattern. So the garden pea can self-fertilize. So what we have right here, here's our flower, and in our flower we have a stigma. This is the female, and inside here are the eggs. And the male filament has an anther on the tip, which has pollen in it, and in the pollen are the sperm. So he found that the garden pea can self-fertilize, which means that the sperm here in the anther can be transferred to the stigma to fertilize the egg. Those he called true breeding plants. True breeding plants. So those are the ones that can self-fertilize. And he made sure by making that cross over and over and over again to show that true breeding plants, the offspring always look like the parents. So in true breeding, let's put that up here. True breeding, offspring always look like, oops, there's an S in there, offspring always look like parents. Okay, but he also found out that what he could do is he could take plant number 1 and he could cut off the filament, cutting off the anthers before the pollen was ready. So he knew that it did not self-fertilize. He could cut those off, and then he could go to another plant. He could go to plant number 2 and take the pollen and the sperm and fertilize plant number 1 with different pollen, with different sperm. So he could make cross fertilizations. Okay, let's see. Is that all? Yeah. And what he did was he looked at one characteristic at a time. So he had one plot of plants and he just looked at seed shape. And then he had another plot of plants and he just looked at seed color. And then another one where he just looked at flower color. So he had enough space where he could do this. Okay, so he would take crosses of true breeding plants. Now remember what our definition of true breeding was, that they were, he made sure that true breeding, that they would self-fertilize and the offspring would always look like the parent. He could go through many generations. And that's what was so great about working with a plant, was that every season he could do many generations of the plants. So true breeding. So he would take a hybridization of two true breeding plants. Now, what is a hybrid? I'm sure we all know what a hybrid is. A hybrid is like a mule, a cross between a donkey and a horse. In this case right here, let's define our hybrid. So a hybrid is a variation. So a hybrid is the oops, wait a minute. That's supposed to be an F. Okay. So an offspring of two different variations of a plant. And in this case, it's of the garden pea. So he took two true breeding plants, and the offspring he called the first generation. So this is the parent generation. So parent generation. This F1 is the first generation, the offspring of the parents. These are the hybrids. And he discovered that 100% all the offspring were all purple flowered plants. But then he let that first generation self-fertilize it. And then he came up with some of them were purple flowered and some of them were white flowered. And because he was a mathematician and he had so many plants that he counted them all, and over again he saw this pattern of one white flower to every 3 purple flowers. So there is a ratio of 3 to 1. Okay, so we are going to look more into this pattern that Gregory Mendel found. I hope you found that interesting.